While America's military stockpiles run thin from arming Ukraine, something far more calculated may be unfolding in the Middle East, and the fingerprints don't belong to Tehran. Here's what nobody is saying out loud. Iran doesn't move alone. It never has. Behind every missile fired by a proxy, behind every escalation timed with surgical precision, there is a broader strategic architecture, and that architecture increasingly points east toward Beijing. China has spent years quietly building economic lifelines into Iran, shielding it from sanctions, buying its oil, and keeping its regime financially viable while Washington watched. That's not charity. That's investment. That's leverage being purchased for a moment exactly like this one. And now, right now, as the United States finds itself stretched across two major conflict zones simultaneously, its ammunition reserves depleted, its defense industrial base exposed, we have to ask the question that every serious analyst is whispering behind closed doors. Was this the plan all along? Because if China helped engineer this moment, America just walked into the most expensive trap in modern geopolitical history. Let's go back for a second because this story doesn't start with a missile launch or a drone strike. It doesn't start with a headline. It starts with a decision made quietly years ago in the kind of rooms where cameras aren't allowed and press releases never follow. It starts with China looking at the global order, the American-led global order that has dominated every corner of this planet since 1945, and deciding methodically, deliberately, that it was time to rewrite the rules. Not with a declaration, not with a speech at the United Nations, but with patience, with economics, with the slow strategic placement of chess pieces across a board that most Americans weren't even watching, and Iran was one of those chess pieces. Now, I want to be careful here because when we talk about Iran, Americans tend to default to a very specific mental image, the chants, the flags, the rhetoric about death to America. And yes, all of that is real. Iran's hostility toward the United States is not manufactured for this story. It has deep historical roots, it has genuine ideological dimensions, and it does not need China to exist. But here's the thing, hostility is one thing. Capability and timing are something else entirely. And when you start looking at the capability Iran has developed over the last decade, and when you start looking at the timing of how that capability has been deployed, the picture gets considerably more complicated than what fits on a bumper sticker. Let's talk about the money first, because money is always where the real story lives. When the United States and its European allies imposed sweeping sanctions on Iran, the theory was straightforward. Squeeze the economy, increase the pain on ordinary Iranians, and eventually the regime either collapses or negotiates. That was the theory. But what the theory required, what it absolutely depended on, was that the major economies of the world would hold the line, that nobody with serious purchasing power would step in and give Iran an economic off-ramp. And for a while, that held. And then China decided it wouldn't. China began purchasing Iranian oil at heavily discounted rates, effectively becoming the financial oxygen machine, keeping the Iranian economy breathing when the sanctions were supposed to be suffocating it. We're not talking about small transactions here. We're talking about billions of dollars flowing into Iranian government coffers year after year in direct defiance of the sanctions architecture the United States spent enormous diplomatic capital constructing. And Beijing did this openly, not secretly. Openly, because they calculated correctly that the United States was not going to go to war with China over Iranian oil purchases. So they kept buying, and Iran kept surviving. And the regime that was supposed to feel existential economic pressure instead felt something else. It felt protected. And when you feel protected by a major power, your behavior changes. Your willingness to take risks changes. Your willingness to fund militias, to arm proxies, to push boundaries in ways that a truly isolated regime simply could not afford, all of that changes. So when we look at Hezbollah's expanded arsenal over the last decade, when we look at the Houthi movement in Yemen developing the kind of drone and missile technology that has now disrupted global shipping lanes and forced the United States Navy into sustained combat operations in the Red Sea, when we look at the network of Iranian-backed militias across Iraq and Syria that have launched hundreds of attacks against American military personnel, we have to ask who paid for all of that. And the answer, at least in significant part, is that China paid for it, not directly. not with a wire transfer labeled proxy militia funding, but by purchasing Iranian oil, by keeping Iranian revenue flowing, by ensuring that the sanctions designed to prevent exactly this kind of regional destabilization never fully worked. Now let's talk about the 25-year cooperation agreement, because this is something that deserves far more attention than it has received in mainstream American media. In 2021, China and Iran signed a comprehensive strategic partnership agreement covering trade, military cooperation, and intelligence sharing over a 25-year period. 25 years. That's not a transactional relationship. That's not a convenience. That is a long-term strategic architecture. The reported value of Chinese investment commitments under that agreement runs into the hundreds of billions of dollars. In exchange, China gets discounted oil, strategic positioning in the Persian Gulf region, and something that is harder to quantify but potentially more valuable than all of it. A partner that is permanently in conflict with America, permanently consuming American attention, permanently draining American resources without China ever having to fire a single shot. Think about that from Beijing's perspective for just a moment. You have a rival, the United States, that you need to weaken. You can't weaken it militarily without catastrophic risk to yourself. You can't weaken it economically through direct confrontation without triggering responses that hurt you as well. But what if you could find a way to keep that rival perpetually engaged in costly, exhausting, resource-draining conflicts in regions that are strategically marginal to your own core interests? What if you could ensure that American aircraft carriers are always being pulled toward the Middle East, that American ammunition stockpiles are always being depleted in theaters far from the Pacific, that American diplomatic bandwidth is always consumed by crises in places that are not the South China Sea, not Taiwan, not the first island chain where your actual strategic competition is taking place? That would be extraordinarily valuable. And it would cost you relatively little if you already have a partner in the region who has every reason to keep poking the American bear. This is the strategic logic that a growing number of serious defense analysts have started to articulate. And it is not a conspiracy theory. It is the application of basic strategic thinking to observable facts. China has an interest in America being stretched thin. Iran has an interest in America being stretched thin. And in a world where interests align, coordination, even informal coordination, even coordination that never gets written down in any document, tends to follow. Now let's bring this home to the arsenal question, because this is where it gets genuinely alarming for anyone paying attention. The United States military has spent the better part of 3 years funneling weapons into Ukraine: artillery shells, air defense missiles, anti-tank systems, ammunition of every description, at a pace that has exposed something uncomfortable about American defense industrial capacity. We built a military designed for dominance, not for sustained high-intensity industrial-scale warfare, the kind of warfare happening in Ukraine, the kind that burns through shells and missiles at rates that our production lines were simply not designed to sustain. And so the stockpiles got drawn down, significantly, uncomfortably. Pentagon officials have said this publicly, which tells you how serious it is, because the Pentagon does not publicly acknowledge ammunition shortfalls unless the situation is pressing enough that concealment is no longer practical. Congress has had hearings about it. Defense contractors have received emergency funding to expand production. All of that is happening right now in real time, because the wars of the last few years have revealed a gap between the military we have and the military we would need if we faced simultaneous major conflicts in multiple theaters. And right now we are facing something that looks uncomfortably like exactly that. American naval forces are engaged in sustained combat operations in the Red Sea against Houthi forces equipped with Iranian weapons and technology. American personnel in Iraq and Syria have been targeted repeatedly. The situation with Iran itself remains on a knife's edge, with the possibility of direct military confrontation never fully off the table. And on the other side of the world, Taiwan remains a flashpoint, the South China Sea remains contested, and China's military buildup continues at a pace that demands American attention and resources. This is not a coincidence of bad luck. This is what strategic overextension looks like when it is being deliberately engineered by an adversary that is patient, that is well-resourced, and that has thought carefully about how to impose costs on the United States without triggering a direct military response. Let's talk about the Houthis specifically for a moment, because their story is one of the most remarkable and underappreciated stories in recent geopolitical history. A few years ago, the Houthis were a relatively localized insurgent group fighting a brutal and complicated civil war in one of the world's poorest countries. Today, they are launching sophisticated ballistic missiles and drones at commercial shipping in one of the world's most critical maritime choke points, forcing the United States and its allies into a sustained military campaign that has cost hundreds of millions of dollars and has not, as of yet, succeeded in stopping the attacks. How did that happen? How does a non-state actor in Yemen acquire the technological capability to threaten global shipping lanes and engage the United States Navy in a sustained conflict? The answer is Iran. And the answer behind that answer is the resources Iran had available because its economy was never truly strangled the way the sanctions were supposed to strangle it. The weapons pipeline from Iran to the Houthis is well documented by now. Ballistic missiles, anti-ship missiles, drone technology, all of it Iranian in origin, much of it reflecting technological advancements that Iran could not have achieved without access to certain components and certain knowledge that flowed through channels that, when you trace them carefully, often have Chinese fingerprints somewhere in the supply chain. Not always, not exclusively, but often enough that the pattern is visible to anyone who is looking for it. And here's the broader point that ties all of this together. We are living through a period of deliberate, coordinated challenge to American global primacy. And that challenge is not coming at us in a form that is easy to respond to. It's not an army massing on a border. It's not a naval fleet sailing toward American shores. It's a series of proxy conflicts, economic arrangements, diplomatic maneuvers, and strategic investments that individually look manageable and collectively amount to a sustained campaign to erode American power, American credibility, and American resources. And because each individual piece of this looks manageable, because each crisis gets addressed in isolation, because Washington tends to respond to what is in front of it rather than what is behind it, the overall strategic architecture of the challenge tends to escape the public debate that it deserves. The American public is paying attention to the price of gas, to the news cycle, to the immediate drama of whatever crisis has erupted this week. And that's understandable. It's human. But in the background, in the space between headlines, a realignment of global power is underway that will determine the shape of the world your children and grandchildren inhabit. And that realignment is being actively managed by Beijing with a sophistication and a patience that American political culture, with its 2-year election cycles and its 24-hour news churn, finds genuinely difficult to match. China is playing a decades-long game. They have said so explicitly. Their planning documents, their military doctrine, their economic strategy, all of it is calibrated toward a horizon that American policymakers rarely have the political luxury of looking toward. When Chinese strategists talk about the middle of this century as the target date for achieving their national rejuvenation goals, they mean it. And every move they make between now and then, every economic relationship cultivated, every proxy conflict sustained, every sanction regime undermined, every American stockpile quietly depleted through the cascading costs of endless regional crises, is a move in service of that long game. So what does the United States do with this? That's the question that doesn't have a clean answer, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise. The honest answer is that responding effectively to this kind of challenge requires exactly the kind of sustained, strategic, bipartisan thinking that American politics is least equipped to produce right now. It requires investment in defense industrial capacity on a scale that has not been seriously undertaken since the Cold War. It requires diplomatic architecture that can actually hold sanction regimes together in a world where China is systematically working to provide off-ramps. It requires a public that understands the stakes clearly enough to support the sustained effort required to address them. And that means having an honest conversation about what is actually happening, rather than the simplified version that fits into a campaign speech or a cable news segment. It requires, in other words, treating this moment with the seriousness it deserves. Because the strain on the American arsenal is not just a logistics problem, it is a symptom. It is a symptom of a strategic environment that has been deliberately shaped over years by adversaries who understood that the most effective way to challenge American power was not head-on. It was sideways. It was through proxies and pipelines and patience. It was through making sure that by the time the moment of real reckoning arrived, America would already be tired, already be stretched, already be having the wrong conversation. We are in that moment right now. And whether or not China wrote the script for everything we are watching in the Middle East, so whether the coordination is explicit or merely convenient, whether there are phone calls or just parallel interests moving in the same direction, the effect is the same. America is paying an enormous price. Its resources are strained, its attention is divided, and the window for getting the strategic response right is not unlimited. The question is not whether we can afford to take this seriously. The question is whether we have the political will and the strategic clarity to do so before the cost of not taking it seriously becomes something we can no longer calculate our way out of. That is the question that is sitting at the center of this story, and it is not a question that is going away anytime soon.